The golden rays of the setting sun painted the sky in hues of amber and crimson, casting a warm glow over NBA legend Marcus Johnson's sprawling backyard. The evening air carried the rich aroma of sizzling steaks, slow-roasted ribs, and freshly grilled vegetables, blending seamlessly with the soft hum of jazz playing through the outdoor speakers. Laughter rang out, bouncing off the elegant stone patio, wrapping the gathering in a cocoon of warmth and joy. This was a rare moment of peace, a chance for Marcus to simply exist beyond the pressures of fame and the expectations of the world. Marcus stood at the grill, a crisp white apron tied around his broad frame, his hands moving with the precision of a seasoned chef. He flipped a thick, juicy steak, the flames licking at the edges, releasing an irresistible aroma. His deep chuckle rumbled as he glanced around, taking in the sight of his closest friends, people who had stood by him through the highs and lows of his career. Charles, his childhood friend, swirled a glass of whiskey, laughing at an inside joke. Tiffany, the woman who had known him since his high school days, leaned back in her chair, eyes closed, savoring the cool breeze. David, a former teammate, playfully tossed a football to Marcus's son, whose laughter was music to his father's ears. This was what life was supposed to be. Not the flashing cameras, not the constant scrutiny, but these small, perfect moments, surrounded by people who truly mattered. Marcus exhaled, feeling a deep sense of gratitude settle in his chest. "Man, I appreciate y'all," he said, raising his glass of sweet tea. "Nights like this is what life's about." The sentiment was echoed in clinking glasses and warm smiles. But just beyond the fence, someone watched. Deborah Kingston, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, stood stiffly on her manicured lawn, her arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. The golden sunset barely softened the sharp angles of her disapproving face. She had never liked Marcus's presence here. It wasn't because he was famous, no. She had no problem with celebrities. It was something else, the way his presence radiated energy, life, and joy. The way the neighborhood had changed since he moved in. The way he had something she would never have, genuine happiness. Deborah had convinced herself that this wasn't about race. That her discomfort had nothing to do with the fact that Marcus's laughter carried across fences that had never known such noise before. But the truth sat bitterly in her chest. This was about control. This was about keeping things the way they had always been. And tonight, she had decided, she wouldn't let it slide. Her fingers twitched toward her phone as her mind crafted the perfect complaint. Not about noise, no. That wouldn't be enough. It had to be something more. Something that would demand immediate action. Marcus, still lost in the bliss of his evening, had no idea what was coming. But in just a few moments, his peaceful night would be shattered. The weight of unspoken prejudices crashing down upon him in a way he never expected. What happens next will leave you speechless. Will Marcus stand his ground? Or will the neighborhood that never welcomed him try to push him out? Stay tuned until the end to uncover the shocking truth. And if you believe in justice and powerful storytelling, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, because stories like this need to be heard. The golden light of the setting sun painted the sky in breathtaking shades of crimson and gold as Marcus Johnson, former NBA legend, stood at his grill, flipping thick, juicy steaks with the ease of a man who had mastered both the game of basketball and the art of relaxation. His backyard was alive with laughter, warmth, and the rich aroma of sizzling meat. This was his sanctuary, the home he had worked tirelessly for. A place where he could finally breathe, away from the expectations, the bright lights, and the never-ending demand to be more. Tonight, he wasn't a superstar, a businessman, or a public figure. He was simply a man enjoying a peaceful evening with his closest friends. But peace, as he would soon realize, was a fragile thing. Beyond the wooden fence, Deborah Kingston stood, her arms crossed so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She watched, her face stiff with disapproval, as Marcus and his friends laughed freely. Unburdened by the world, she had lived in this neighborhood for over a decade, a self-appointed guardian of its traditions. And Marcus's presence disrupted everything she believed was right. It wasn't the fame that unsettled her, it was him. The effortless way he commanded attention. The joy he brought to others. The way he represented a change she didn't want to accept. Deborah had tried to tolerate it. She had gritted her teeth every time she saw his young son playing outside. Every time she heard the jazz drifting over the fence. Every time she caught a glimpse of his broad smile as he greeted the mailman like an old friend. But tonight? Tonight was the last straw. The scent of barbecue. The sound of clinking glasses. The echo of deep laughter. It was too much. Too loud. Too different. Her fingers tightened around her phone. Her heart pounding with a bitter mix of frustration and something darker. She wasn't going to let this continue. She wouldn't allow her neighborhood to change. With a deep breath, she dialed. Hello. Yes, I need to report a disturbance. There's a large, loud group in my neighborhood. And I feel unsafe. The man, he's aggressive. And I think there's drinking involved. Please send someone immediately. She hung up, satisfaction curling at the edges of her lips. This wasn't just about noise. It was about control. She had set something in motion. And she wanted to see how it unfolded. Marcus, still blissfully unaware, raised his glass of sweet tea and smiled at his friends. Man, I appreciate y'all. Nights like this? This is what life's about. But the moment of peace shattered. A piercing wail cut through the night air. Red and blue light splitting the darkness. Flashing ominously against the pristine walls of his mansion. The backyard, once alive with warmth, turned cold in an instant. The laughter died. Glasses were set down. Eyes widened in silent understanding. Marcus turned, his jaw tightening as he saw the police cars rolling to a stop in front of his home. Deborah stepped forward from the shadows. Her face perfectly composed, a performance of concern as she waved toward the officers. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said, pressing a trembling hand to her chest. "I was afraid. He was so loud. And I didn't know what he was going to do." Marcus exhaled slowly, his hands curling at his sides before he forced himself to relax. He had been here before. Not in this exact situation. But in ones that carried the same weight. Being watched too closely in a high-end store. Being followed in a neighborhood he had every right to walk through. Being stopped in expensive cars that he had bought with his own hard-earned money. He knew exactly how quickly perception could shift. A big, confident black man having a good time was suddenly a threat. One officer, a man in his mid-40s with weary eyes, turned to Marcus. "Sir, we need to see some identification." It wasn't a request. Marcus moved slowly. Carefully, he could feel his friends tense behind him, their breathing shallow, their expressions dark with unspoken words. He pulled out his phone, scrolling to the documents that proved, without a doubt, that this house was his. "Here," he said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "I've owned this place for 5 years." The officer studied the screen. His partner glanced between Marcus and the backyard. The food, untouched. The guests, quiet. There was no crime here. No threat. Nothing that warranted their presence. "We got a call about a disturbance," the officer said, lifting his gaze. "The only disturbance," Marcus said evenly, his patience tested but not yet broken, "is my neighbor calling you over a barbecue." Deborah bristled. It wasn't just a barbecue. She snapped. It was loud. And the smoke. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "We're outside. That's how grills work." The younger officer turned to Deborah. "Ma'am, did he ever threaten you?" For a fraction of a second, Deborah hesitated, and in that hesitation, everyone saw it. The lie, the malice. She had overplayed her hand. He just made me uncomfortable," she muttered, her voice suddenly smaller. The older officer sighed, his face hardening. "So, to be clear, you called 911 because your neighbor made you uncomfortable?" Deborah stiffened. "No, I mean, it was the noise, too, and the way he looked at me." A sharp, bitter laugh broke the silence. Marcus's friend David shook his head. "The way he looked at you? That's what we're doing now." The officers exchanged a glance. They knew. And now, Deborah knew that they knew. The older officer turned back to Marcus, his tone noticeably softer. "Sorry for the trouble, sir. Looks like there's no real issue here." Deborah's face twisted. "You're just going to let this go?" she demanded. He's changing everything. He doesn't belong here." The younger officer's jaw tightened. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "you need to stop talking right now." Because she had crossed the line. And now? Now, she was the one who had to face the consequences. Marcus studied her for a long moment. Not with anger, not with hatred, but with something deeper. Pity. Because this was never about noise. It was about fear. About control. About a world she couldn't stop from changing. "You could have just come over," Marcus said finally, shaking his head. Grabbed a plate. Had a good time with us. But Deborah didn't answer. Because deep down, she knew the truth. As the police cars pulled away, as the tension in the air slowly dissolved, as his friends exhaled in relief, Marcus turned back to his grill. Because he wasn't going to let her take this night away from him. If you believe in justice, if you stand against people like Deborah who try to control others through fear, make sure to like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Because these stories need to be heard. The warmth of the evening air wrapped around Malcolm Hayes like a comforting embrace as he walked toward his car. His mind filled with excitement. College acceptance letters sat on his kitchen table, waiting to be read once he got home. Tonight, he had been celebrating with friends. A rare moment of joy in his hard-working life, where every achievement came at the cost of sweat and sacrifice. But before he could even reach the driver's seat, flashing blue and red lights shattered the peace. His chest tightened, his fingers hesitating on the door handle as a sharp voice cut through the night. "Hands where I can see them." The words hit Malcolm like a punch, his heart hammering against his ribs as he instinctively complied. A police officer, Ryan Wallace, stalked toward him, a look of certainty in his eyes, as if Malcolm's guilt had already been decided. "What's in your pockets?" Wallace demanded. "Drugs? Stolen goods?" Malcolm's brows furrowed. "Sir, I was just leaving a friend's house. I live 3 blocks down." But his words meant nothing. Wallace shoved him against the car, the cold metal biting into his skin. Malcolm didn't resist, he knew better. He had been taught since childhood what to do in situations like this. Stay still, stay quiet, stay alive. But none of that mattered. Wallace patted him down roughly, his hands moving with aggression, not caution. And then, just as Malcolm opened his mouth to protest, something small and plastic hit the pavement with a soft clink. Wallace's eyes gleamed as he bent down and picked up a tiny bag filled with white powder. Well, Wallace sneered, holding the bag up. "Looks like we got ourselves a drug dealer." Malcolm's stomach dropped. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. "That's not mine." Wallace laughed. "Oh, really? Then how did it end up at your feet?" Malcolm's mind raced. He had seen stories like this before. Heard the horror from his mother, from teachers, from news reports that always ended the same way: young black men. Their futures stolen, their voices silenced. But never, not once, did he think it would happen to him. His voice trembled. "Officer, please, check the cameras. Ask someone. I didn't do anything." Wallace tightened his grip on Malcolm's wrist, yanking it behind his back. "Save it for the judge." The metallic snap of the handcuffs made Malcolm flinch. Terror gripped him like a vice. But the real horror? The look of smug satisfaction on Wallace's face. By the time he was shoved into the back of the police car, tears stung Malcolm's eyes, not just from fear, but from rage, from helplessness. This wasn't just a bad night. This was a stolen future. And then, a voice, a calm, steady voice from somewhere in the crowd. "Let him go." Malcolm turned, his breath catching. A retired principal, James Holloway, stood tall, his eyes sharp, his phone held high. "I saw everything," Holloway said, "and I recorded it all." Silence. A deadly, pulsing silence. Wallace stiffened. The officers exchanged looks. Malcolm's heart pounded as hope flickered in his chest. Holloway lifted his phone higher. "Release that boy, now." Malcolm held his breath, waiting to see if justice would finally win. Want to know what happens next? Like, comment, and subscribe to see how this fight for justice unfolds. Let's make sure stories like Malcolm's are never ignored. The courtroom was silent, the weight of truth pressing down on everyone present. Malcolm Hayes sat at the defendant's table, his hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms to stop the trembling. He wasn't supposed to be here. He had done nothing wrong. But there he was, accused, humiliated, and fighting for his future. Across the room, Officer Ryan Wallace, the man responsible for this nightmare, sat with an air of arrogant confidence. For Wallace, this was just another case. Just another black kid caught in the system. Another name he could erase without consequence. But tonight, the world was watching. The prosecutor, Ms. Danielle Brooks, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney, stood and pressed play on the projector. The courtroom gasped as the screen flickered to life. The video from James Holloway's dash cam played. exposing the truth in painful clarity. There was Wallace, approaching Malcolm's car. There was the moment he reached into his own pocket, subtly slipping the tiny bag onto the ground. And then, the audio. Well, looks like we got ourselves a drug dealer. The words echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Wallace's smug smirk disappeared. Malcolm gritted his teeth, his heart pounding. This wasn't just about proving his innocence. This was about exposing the system that had tried to destroy him. Ms. Brooks turned toward the judge. Your Honor, this is clear evidence of police misconduct. Officer Wallace planted drugs on an innocent young man, attempting to rob him of his future. Wallace's lawyer sputtered, scrambling to explain, but the damage was done. Then, the judge spoke. Officer Wallace, stand up. Wallace hesitated, but under the sharp glare of the judge, he rose. The air crackled with tension. Mr. Hayes, the judge continued, turning to Malcolm with something resembling regret. You were wrongfully arrested, wrongfully accused, and unjustly treated. The court recognizes this as a miscarriage of justice. Malcolm exhaled sharply, the weight on his chest lifting, not completely, but just enough to breathe. Wallace tried to protest, but the judge cut him off. Officer Wallace, the evidence against you is undeniable. You are hereby found guilty of police misconduct, evidence tampering, and perjury. Gasps filled the courtroom. Malcolm's mother, Vanessa, broke into tears, clutching her son's arm. She had fought, prayed, and never let hope die, even when it seemed impossible. The judge's gavel slammed. Officer Wallace, you are sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Justice. Malcolm didn't cheer, didn't gloat, he just sat there. The reality of what had happened sinking in. His life had nearly been stolen. If not for one man's dash cam, for one person's courage to speak up, he could have been behind bars right now instead of Wallace. As he stepped out of the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers, holding signs that read, "Justice for Malcolm," and "End police corruption." Reporters swarmed him, cameras flashing, voices calling his name. Malcolm turned to the cameras. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who never got their day in court. Everyone who wasn't lucky enough to have a witness. We need to fight for them, too. Now, it's your turn. Like this video, drop a comment, and subscribe to support justice. Let's make sure no one else has to fight alone. The prison gates clanged shut behind Ryan Wallace, the sound reverberating through the air like a final, inescapable sentence. 10 years. 10 years to reflect. 10 years to face the consequences of his actions. But as he was led down the cold, lifeless corridor, he wasn't the only one who had change. On the other side of the city, Malcolm Hayes stood tall on the steps of his university, a place he had once feared he would never see again. His mother, Vanessa, clutched his arm tightly, tears glistening in her eyes as she watched him prepare for his first day of classes. It was a moment she had prayed for, fought for, a moment they had almost lost. But justice had prevailed. Malcolm exhaled, gripping his backpack strap tighter. This wasn't just about him. This was about the thousands of young men like him, the ones who never got their names cleared. The ones still behind bars for crimes they never committed. As he stepped through the gates of the university, he carried their voices with him. But not everyone was ready to let go of the past. At the prison, Wallace sat alone in his cell, rage simmering beneath his skin. He had spent years believing he was untouchable. He had ruined lives and walked away without a scratch. Now, for the first time, he was forced to live in the reality he had created for others. Malcolm's name haunted him, the sound of the gavel, the sight of the courtroom turning against him. The moment he realized he wasn't in control anymore, it all replayed in his mind like a broken record. Outside, the world was changing. The viral video that had exposed Wallace's corruption sparked conversations across the country. More victims came forward, revealing stories of abuse, false charges, and lives stolen by officers like him. Investigations were launched, new policies were discussed, and the world began to wake up. Malcolm's fight was far from over. He started speaking at community events, advocating for reform and accountability. Every time he shared his story, more people listened, more people cared. His voice, once silenced by fear, was now a beacon of hope for those who had none. But this fight is bigger than just one man. That's where you come in. If you believe in justice, if you believe in standing up against corruption, drop a comment below to show your support for Malcolm and his fight. Let's flood this video with positivity, encouragement, and unity. Because stories like Malcolm's deserve to be heard. Because somewhere out there, there's another Malcolm, falsely accused, trapped in a system designed to break him. And he's waiting for us to speak up. The night was thick with tension as Eleanor Davis gripped Duke's leash, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The dimly lit street felt suffocating, each shadow stretching like unseen hands reaching for her. She knew they were watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Duke, her loyal Rottweiler, was already tense, his deep growl a warning in the darkness. But she was outnumbered. From the alley ahead, 3 figures emerged, their silhouettes blocking her only way forward. Brian Tanner, the man who had harassed her before, stepped into the glow of a flickering streetlight, a twisted grin curling on his lips. Well, look who we have here," he sneered, his voice dripping with malice. His 2 accomplices, grinning like wolves, closed in, cutting off any escape route. Eleanor's fingers clenched around Duke's leash, her mind racing. She had lived through moments like this before, where fear wrapped around her throat like a noose, where the world told her to shrink, to be silent. But not tonight. "You shouldn't be walking alone, sweetheart," one of the men taunted. Stepping closer, Duke let out a thunderous bark, his powerful body coiled like a spring ready to snap. The men hesitated, their confidence wavering for the first time. "Back off," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the terror flooding her veins. Brian chuckled, but it was nervous now. "You think a dog's gonna save you?" Duke's low growl turned into a snarl, his sharp teeth flashing under the streetlight. Then, everything happened at once. Brian lunged, a fatal mistake. Duke exploded forward, knocking him to the ground with bone-crushing force. The other 2 men panicked, scrambling away as Brian screamed. Eleanor, fueled by a surge of adrenaline, grabbed her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed 911. Get him off! Get him off!" Brian shrieked, but Eleanor didn't move. "You wanted to teach me a lesson?" she said, her voice shaking with rage. "Well, here's yours." The wail of approaching sirens split the night, and the other men vanished into the shadows, abandoning Brian to his fate. Within minutes, the police flooded the scene, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Officers rushed forward, pulling Duke away as Brian writhed in pain, his arm torn and bleeding. "He attacked me," Brian howled, but Eleanor stood tall, refusing to let the lie take root. "I was defending myself," she said, her voice unwavering. Security cameras had caught everything. The truth played out in crystal clarity. Eleanor, alone, surrounded, the threats, the attack, the moment Duke saved her life. Brian was arrested, his accomplices found and charged. But this wasn't just about one night. It was about every woman who had ever walked alone, every person who had ever been cornered and told they didn't belong. Eleanor had survived, not as a victim, but as a fighter. And now, her story needed to be told. Drop a comment below if you stand with Eleanor. Like this video to support those who refuse to be silenced. Because bravery deserves to be seen. The alley was silent now. But the storm inside Eleanor's chest hadn't settled. The police had taken Brian Tanner away. But the weight of the night still clung to her like a second skin. Duke, ever faithful, sat by her side, his powerful frame pressed against her leg, offering comfort in a way words never could. But the danger wasn't over. As she gave her statement to the officers, a cold realization crept down her spine. Brian's accomplices were still out there. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear crashing over her. They had run when the sirens arrived. But they wouldn't stay gone forever. They had wanted to hurt her. And now, with Brian behind bars, they had a reason to come back. One of the officers, a man with tired eyes and a badge that read, Detective Simmons, took a step closer. "Miss Davis, I strongly suggest you stay somewhere safe for a few days. They won't take this lightly." Eleanor's throat tightened, but she refused to show weakness. "I won't be chased out of my own life." Detective Simmons sighed. "Then be ready." She was. But even preparedness couldn't stop the nightmares. That night, as she lay in bed, sleep refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flickering streetlights, the shadows moving closer, the malice in Brian's grin. Her fingers curled into her blanket. But it wasn't enough. Nothing felt safe anymore. Then, Duke's ears perked up. Eleanor barely had time to process it before a loud crash shattered the silence. Her breath caught, the sound of glass breaking. Coming from her living room. They were here. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. She grabbed the baseball bat she kept by her bed and raced to the hallway. Duke was already ahead of her. His muscles tensed, teeth bared, a low, guttural growl ripping through the air. Her heart pounded like a war drum as she reached the living room. Shards of glass glistened on the floor. The window shattered. The curtains billowed from the night breeze. But Eleanor knew, this was no accident. Then, a shadow moved. Adrenaline surged through her veins. A man, one of Brian's accomplices, was inside. He barely had time to react before Duke lunged. The impact was violent. The man let out a choked scream as Duke's weight slammed him against the floor. Snarling, relentless, Eleanor didn't hesitate. She swung the bat. The solid crack echoed through the house as it connected with his arm. He howled in pain, struggling, but Duke had him pinned. With shaking hands, Eleanor grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Her voice was steady, but inside, she was raging. Someone broke into my house. Send help, now. The seconds felt like hours. But she didn't let go of the bat. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was angry. By the time the sirens screamed through the neighborhood, the man was still on the floor. Blood dripping from his lip. His breath coming in ragged gasps. The officers stormed in, weapons drawn, but all Eleanor did was exhale. Her chest rising and falling with the weight of everything. They came for her, and they failed. This fight wasn't over, but neither was she. If you stand with Eleanor, drop a comment below, like this video to show your support. Because courage isn't just about surviving, it's about refusing to be a victim. The weight of the night still pressed heavily on Eleanor's chest as she sat at her kitchen table. Hands trembling around a cup of untouched tea. She should have felt safe now. The men who had come after her had either been arrested or were on the run. But the ghosts of their threats still lingered in every dark corner of her home. She could still hear the glass shattering, the intruder's ragged breathing, the sound of Duke's furious growl tearing through the silence. She reached down, running her fingers through Duke's thick fur. He had been her protector, her shield. Without him, she wasn't sure she would have survived. He had saved her once. But what about next time? Because there would be a next time. People like Brian Tanner didn't just disappear. A knock at the door made her jolt, her heart slamming against her ribs. Her hands tightened into fists. But Duke was already on his feet. Ears perked, body tensed. She took a deep breath and forced herself to move. Her legs unsteady beneath her. The past few days had taken more from her than she wanted to admit. Through the peephole, she saw Detective Simmons. She hesitated for only a moment before unlocking the door. "Eleanor," he said, his voice laced with exhaustion. But there was something else in his eyes, something that made her stomach twist. "We need to talk." She didn't want to hear it. Not now. Not when she was still trying to scrape together the shattered pieces of her life. But she nodded anyway. They sat across from each other, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Then, he said the words she had feared the most. "Brian Tanner is out on bail." The room spun around her. "No," she whispered, her grip tightening around the arm of the chair. Simmons sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "We pushed for him to be held. But his lawyer argued that he wasn't a flight risk. His family paid his bail. He's free, for now." Eleanor closed her eyes, forcing back the wave of panic threatening to consume her. Brian Tanner wasn't just a man with a grudge, he was a man who wanted revenge. And now, he had every reason to come after her. She could feel Duke's presence beside her, his warm body pressed against her leg, as if sensing her distress. He had fought for her before, and he would do it again. But how much longer could she keep fighting? She looked up at Simmons, her voice stronger than she expected. "So what now?" His gaze met hers, serious and unyielding. "We'll keep an eye on him. But Eleanor, you need to be careful." Careful. Careful hadn't saved her from the first attack. Careful wouldn't stop Brian from coming back. But she wasn't going to run. Not now. Not ever. She had already fought too hard to give up. Eleanor sat in the dim glow of her living room, staring at the locked door, her heart pounding in her chest. She could still hear Brian Tanner's voice in her mind, the way he had smirked when he was dragged out in handcuffs. Now, he was free. Free to come back. Free to finish what he started. Duke lay at her feet, his ears twitching at every small sound outside. He could sense her fear. His presence was the only thing grounding her, reminding her that she wasn't alone. But even as she reached down to scratch behind his ears, she felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. How much longer could she live like this? Detective Simmons had told her to be careful. But careful didn't stop monsters like Brian. Her hands curled into fists as a lump formed in her throat. She had fought so hard, stood in court, faced the man who tried to break her, told her story in front of strangers. She had done everything right. And yet, justice still wasn't guaranteed. Tears burned in her eyes. But she refused to let them fall. She wasn't going to let fear win. Eleanor pushed herself up, stepping toward the window. The night was quiet, but she knew better than to trust the silence. And then, a shadow moved. Her breath caught. Duke's body tensed beside her, his low growl rumbling through the room. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her phone. Was it Brian? Or was her mind playing tricks on her? No, she knew better than to ignore her instincts. Her heart pounded as she hit the call button, whispering to the dispatcher, "I think someone is outside my house." Duke let out a sharp bark, loud and fierce. Whoever was out there knew they had been seen. Seconds stretched into eternity before the distant wail of sirens shattered the night. But Eleanor wasn't just waiting for help. She was ready. She had survived once, and she would survive again. The sirens screamed through the night. But Eleanor knew better than to let herself feel safe just yet. She kept her eyes locked on the shadow outside, her pulse thundering in her ears. Was it Brian? Had he really come back? That smug grin replaced with something darker, something more dangerous? Duke remained by her side, his muscles coiled, ready to protect her like he had before. He had saved her life once. But should it have come to this? Should she still be fighting? Still be looking over her shoulder? Still be afraid in her own home? Justice had been served, or so she thought. But monsters don't just disappear. The figure outside moved, slow, deliberate, taunting. A flicker of light revealed a face she prayed she'd never see again. Brian, free, smirking, like none of it had ever happened. Eleanor's grip tightened around her phone. She had made a promise, to herself, to Duke, to every survivor who had ever been forced to fight for their safety. She wasn't running, not this time. The red and blue lights painted her walls as the police arrived. Tires screeching against the pavement. Officers poured out, voices commanding Brian to stop, to put his hands where they could see them. But he didn't move. His eyes stayed on Eleanor. "Thought you could ruin my life?" he sneered. "You should have stayed quiet." Rage burned in Eleanor's chest. She had stayed quiet once before. And look where it got her. Duke let out a snarl, his body pushing forward, warning, protecting. The officers closed in, weapons drawn, voices sharp. Brian's smirk faltered for the first time. Eleanor stepped forward. She had spent too much time being afraid. "You ruined your own life," she said, voice steady, strong. "And now, you're going to pay for it." The officers took him down, his protests drowned out by the rush of adrenaline in Eleanor's veins. This time, there would be no second chances. She let out a shaky breath, kneeling beside Duke, running a hand through his fur. "It's over," she whispered, almost to convince herself. But this wasn't just her victory. It was for everyone who had ever been silenced. For everyone still fighting. As the dust settled and the last echoes of sirens faded into the night, Eleanor stood in the doorway of her home, finally feeling a sense of peace she had long been denied. The battle had been fought, the monster exposed, and justice delivered, not just for her, but for everyone who had been wronged, for every voice that had been silenced. Duke, her loyal protector, rested at her feet, his dark eyes watching her as if making sure she was truly safe this time. She knelt down, pressing her forehead to his, a silent promise passing between them. They had survived, together. But survival wasn't enough. This fight was never just about one night or one villain. It was about the deeper truth. How many others had been through the same pain? How many still lived in fear, waiting for justice that never came? Eleanor knew her story wasn't unique, and that made it even more important to tell. So here's the lesson. When fear knocks, courage must answer. When injustice rises, truth must be louder. Eleanor refused to stay silent. And because of that, she won. To anyone listening right now, remember this. Silence gives power to those who abuse it. Speak up, stand your ground, and never let fear dictate your future. If Eleanor's story inspired you, hit the like button to show your support. Drop a comment below. Let her know she's not alone. And if you believe in stories that empower, subscribe to the channel so you never miss another one. Because every story matters, and together, we make sure they're heard.